episode 22 of the video series, we saw how in Revelation chapter 11 brought an end to the whole series of events that were destined to occur before Yeshua handed everything back to his Father, and all the people who were remaining at that stage were to have access to the tree of life. Chapter 11 concluded with the temple in heaven being opened and the Ark of the Covenant being seen for the first time since it disappeared when the glory of God departed from the first temple in Jerusalem, as explained by Ezekiel chapter 10. Now, moving on through chapters 12 through 22, we find that they are not a series of new events, but instead a more detailed look into the same events that we considered in chapters 4 through 11. Chapter 12 dealt with the birth of Yeshua and his ascension into the presence of his Father on Bikurim 30 CE, which was the day on which he received all authority in both heaven and on earth. However, he is yet to take up the full control of the people on earth when he returns. Then chapters 13 through 20, while appearing to be a completely new vision, is in fact a deepening of things explained to Yochanan in chapters 8 through 11. While the earlier chapters comprise a series of scenes centered around and reaching out from the heavenly throne room, in chapters 13 through 20, the focus is on two beasts, which Yochanan sees in his second vision. In the latter chapters, Yochanan sees the scene through a different kaleidoscope, because in the earlier ones, the shards of glass that formed those various scenes represented the beings in the heavenly throne room, while the shards now, when they are shuffled in the new kaleidoscope, represent two beasts and the earthly nations. Each pattern change deepens our understanding of how the empires and subsequent nations of the world have developed through history, and particularly in the current lead up to the return of Yeshua, and beyond that stage to when he will finally hand all things back to his Father. So having laid that foundation, I now want to focus on chapter 13, where Yochanan sees two strange beasts, one coming up out of the sea and the other coming from the earth. The first beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. On each horn is a royal crown, and on the heads a series of blasphemous names. The second beast had 2 horns and it looks like a lamb. Both descriptions indicate that both beasts are the work of the adversary Satan. Yochanan goes on to describe the characteristics of the first beast as being a strange animal that looks like a leopard, has feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. That description of the beast matches perfectly with what we find in Daniel chapter 7, where we're told how he describes the 3 animals which he saw in his dreams. The beast Daniel saw is almost identical with the one Yochanan saw in Revelation chapter 13. Not only have they many common features, they also represent the same earthly empires that during the march of history have impacted directly on the people of Israel, and more particularly Yehuda during the Second Temple era. And starting in Daniel chapter 7 verses 1 and 2, he says that the dream occurred in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babel, where he sees the 4 winds breaking out over the great sea, that is the Mediterranean. They appear to be the same 4 winds that Yochanan saw being held back, as described in Revelation chapter 7 verse 1, where he said, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back 4 winds of the earth, so that no wind would blow on the land or the sea or any tree. Daniel goes on to describe the 4 huge animals that came up out of the sea, and how each was different in character. Daniel is seeing the 4 animals, while Yochanan, in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 4, while describing the same beast, only mentions the first 3 animals. Those 3 animals are common to both the dream and the vision, like being likened to the lion, the bear, and the leopard. However, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 7, he goes on to describe a 4th animal by saying that it was dreadful, horrible, extremely strong, and with great iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and stamped its feet on what was left. It was different from all the other animals that had gone before it, and it had 10 horns. Daniel's 4th animal is the one which Yochanan refers to as the beast. One feature that Daniel does not mention is that Yochanan's beast had 7 heads. That is an important point of difference, because when Yochanan received his vision in 95 CE, only 6 heads existed, but Daniel had not been given any details about the heads, which is a feature I will consider in more detail shortly. So what we are seeing in both Daniel's dream and Yochanan's vision is that the animals represents an earthly, world-dominating empire. Each animal represents an earthly, world-dominating empire. Then in chapter 8, Daniel goes on to define the first 2 as being two-horned ram and a shaggy male goat. In chapter 8, verse 20 and 21, Daniel defines the 2 empires as the ram with 2 horns, which are the kings of Persia, Media and Persia, and the shaggy male goat is the king of Greece. He then goes on to explain that the prominent horn between the eyes is the king of Greece, whom we now know, of course, as Alexander the Great, and he would be followed within 10 years by his 4 generals. So from chapter 7, we see that the first 3 animals, the first was a lion, which we now know, of course, represents the kingdom of Babylon. Hence, the 3 empires Daniel defined were Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Each one successively dominated the people of Yehuda, firstly during the Babylonian exile, and then through the majority of the Second Temple era. Then the 4th animal, which Daniel did not identify, but we now know is to be the Roman Empire, and that dominated the people of Yehuda for a very long time. Even now, the Western nations that grew out of the Roman Empire still, to this day, are giving the modern state of Israel a constant grief about the need for a 2-state solution in their territory. While Daniel, in chapter 8, names 3 empires and alludes to the 4th, only Yochanan spoke of the beast as having 7 heads and 10 horns. But so far, we have only identified 4 out of the 7 empires. So who and where are the other 3? The answer is found by Yochanan in Revelation chapter 17, where an angel explains to him about the beast and a woman who rides that beast, where in verses 9 through 11 he says, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman is sitting. Also they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is now living, and the other is yet to come. And when it does come, it must remain for a little while. The beast which you once saw, and now is not, is an 8th king. It comes from the 7 and is on its way to destruction." Here we have reference to all 7 heads, where Yochanan is told that the 5 had already fallen. So assuming that the words refer to the year 95 CE, when Yochanan received the vision, we can deduce from the 5 kings or empires that he had been speaking about were the ones that had supremacy before the vision was given. The 5 world empires the scriptures speak about in relation to Israel are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Then the angel said, one is now living, which in 95 CE was the Roman Empire, and therefore that would have been the 6th. And then there's another yet to come. The only large empire that rose after Rome that that directly impacted upon Israel was the Ottoman Empire, which would be the 7th. As the angel says about that king, he must remain for only a little while. So we see that the Ottoman Empire only lasted for 400 years, from 1517 to 1917, and was conquered in World War I. That comparison is with Rome, which lasted a very long time. The angel then concludes the count by saying that the beast is the 8th king, that it is the one that was and now is not, meaning that the beast comprised all 7 kings that could not have come into existence until after the fall of the 7th king, that's the Ottoman Empire. But he also says, now it is not, which implies that Yochanan was again looking at the period which is known, of course, as the Day of the Lord, which is the reign of Yeshua, when Satan, of course, and his proxies will be chained for the 1,000 years. Having determined the identity of each of the 7 heads, the angel then goes on to explain the reality of the 10 horns, saying in verse 12, the 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet begun to rule, but they receive power as kings for 1 hour along with the beast. We see from that verse that the 10 horns only appeared after the 7 kings begin to manifest themselves together as a collective body, which is of course called the 8th king or the beast. As for the 10 horns, they become kings for 1 hour along with the beast. However, neither Daniel nor Yochanan tell us who those 10 short-lived kings are. But modern history records that following the First World War and after the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France and Russia together divided the former Arab League into 10 small separate nations. Under the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, during World War I, various regions were actually allocated to the Arab tribes, making them autonomous nations under the leaders appointed by Britain and France. The only exception was the territory then known, of course, as Palestine, which remained under the British mandate until May 1948, when the new modern state of Israel was formed. Hence, we can see that soon as World War I had ended, the tensions in the Middle East began to develop. But who are those 10 Arab nations that were established through the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UEA, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the Kingdom of Jordan. The only exclusion from the Gulf states is Oman, which was never part of the Ottoman Empire and has always remained apart with self-rule. Even today, Oman remains as an independent entity in the Arab world. Having finally identified the 7 kings and the 10 horns, we see that together they constitute the beast. And, as Yochanan has shown, the beast is an eighth king. However, by the end of World War I, there were not only 7 historical empires, but also many other smaller nations that had begun to break free from various parts of the fragmented Roman Empire. Development of many European nations had occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries, during and following the period we now know as the Age of Enlightenment, which coincided with a rapid increase in the colonization of many parts of the New World. The most prominent example of colonization being, of course, the formation of the USA in 1776 CE. Finally, following First World War, the political structure in many Western and even Eastern European nations changed with the rise of a modern liberal democracy, which gained prominence with its origins reaching back into the time of the Age of Enlightenment, and particularly during the French Revolution. Over the next 2 centuries, democracy began to take hold in Europe and USA and even beyond. In spite of all these changes, no new empires developed because Europe and the USA remained as a modern-day expression of the ideals of the Roman Empire. The classical Roman Empire never died. Instead, it morphed into what is now known as the modern nations of the Western world, including the USA, and countries have grown out from the British Empire. Slowly, the kings of many nations began to capitulate in favour of the rising tide of liberal democracy. The autocratic power of a king slowly gave way to the new breed of constitutional monarch, where the power of the king was shared with a government elected by the people. Therefore, having been shattered by World War I, many nations of the world sought an organisation that could prevent further wars by disarmament, democracy, interstate negotiations. Hence, the democratic-styled League of Nations was formed. Initially, as an alliance between the 7 historical empires and a series of nations, which collectively came to be the first beast spoken about both in Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, was the one that rose out of the sea. However, history shows that the League of Nations was short-lived because of the overpowering dominance of the victorious Allied forces, which brought about an increasing economic pressure on the vanquished nations of Europe and Asia. Hence, following the expansionary period of the 1920s, the Great Depression that struck the world in 1929 gave rise to fascism among the Axis powers, spearheaded by Germany, Italy, and Japan, and which finally led to World War II. Hence, the complete failure of the League of Nations to prevent World War II meant Hitler, as the ultimate autocrat, along with other fascist leaders of the Axis powers, confronted the Allied forces in battles throughout the war years of 1939 to 45. When Hitler finally committed suicide and the Third Reich fell, World War II ended, and the new democratic organization arose in 1946 in the form of the United Nations, which was effectively a resurrection of the League of Nations. The rise of the United Nations in place of the League of Nations may well be the outworking of the words of Revelation chapter 13 verse 3, where Yochanan says, "One of the heads of the beast appeared to have received a fatal wound, but the fatal wound was healed, and while the earth followed after the beast in amazement. While verse 3 is referring to one of the heads having received that fatal wound, by contrast, verse 12 says it was actually the beast that received the fatal wound. So rather than being just one head that was wounded, it makes much more sense that the whole beast was wounded, meaning that it was rendered powerless during the Second World War. Hence, the League of Nations morphed into the United Nations. Following on, in verse 4, Yochanan says, they worshipped the dragon because he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who can fight against it? Yochanan does not say who he was referring to when he starts the verse with the pronoun they. Was he meaning all the peoples of the earth, or just the national leaders who had aligned themselves with that beast? I don't know the answer. But moving on, we see that there is a natural break in the narrative between verses 4 and 5, because starting in verse 5, the tone of the narrative in the next 5 verses appears to be speaking about a totally different time period, where Yochanan says, it was given a mouth speaking arrogant blasphemies, and it was given authority to act for 42 months. So it opened its mouth in blasphemies against God, to insult his name and his Shekinah and those living in heaven. It was allowed to make war on God's holy people and to defeat them, and it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Everyone living on earth will worship it except those whose names are written in the book of life, belonging to the Lamb, slaughtered before the world was founded. Those who have ears, let them hear. Now let's unpack those words in those 5 verses and see what Yochanan was saying. Firstly, Yochanan was speaking about the beast being given a mouth to speak arrogant blasphemies, meaning it was profaning God and his Shekinah and all those living in heaven. Secondly, it carries out its actions over a period of 42 months, which is the same period as described in Revelation chapter 11, where the narrative is clearly speaking about the period after Satan is let loose from his chains. It is the time when the 2 witnesses are attacked and killed. Thirdly, the beast was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And that is everyone on earth, all of whom would worship it, except those whose names were written in the book of life. So it appears these verses are referring to the 42 months, or 1260 days, when Satan musters all the people of Gog and Magog, as referred to in Revelation chapter 20, verse 8. Because all who are living on earth are being forced to make a choice whether or not to worship the beast. However, the last few words of verse 8 are rather strangely arranged, because it says, everyone living will worship it except for those whose names are in the book of life, belonging to the Lamb who was slaughtered before the world was founded. Clearly, the Lamb was not slaughtered before the world was founded. Is the verse trying to say that those who are still on earth at that stage are the ones who will voluntarily worship the beast? Because the other passages in Revelation suggest that by that stage, all the names written of those written in the book of life will have been taken into heaven, out of the reach of Satan. If all that occurred immediately before Yeshua returned, it would impact on just one generation of mankind, meaning that the unrighteous people who had died throughout history would be spared the ultimate test, which does not match with the rest of Revelation. Therefore, I suggest that Yochanan is seeing the unrighteous people who are remaining on earth after the restoration reign of Yeshua has been completed. By that stage, all the resurrected mankind who have been shown the true depth of the sovereign plan of God, and as Yochanan says in chapter 7 verses 9 to 10, there before me was a huge crowd, too large for anyone to count, from every nation, tribe, people and language. They were standing in front of the throne and in front of the Lamb, dressed in white robes and holding palm branches in their hands. And they shouted victory to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So moving on from there to chapter 13 verse 11, Yochanan turns his kaleidoscope yet again. We see the second beast, this one rising out of the earth. It is different from the first one. It has 2 horns like those of a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. The narrative about the timing of this appearance suggests that it arises while the first beast is still present. However, Yochanan also says that at the time the fatal wound inflicted on the first beast has been healed, so the second beast must arise, sometime during the time of the UN. That is assuming that my earlier reasoning is correct. Further, the latter beast is said to be like a lamb, suggesting that it could well be a satanic mimic of Yeshua himself. This is reinforced by the words of verse 16, where it says it forces everyone, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on his right hand or on his forehead. The marking of those people is very similar to what was spoken about in the sealing of the 144,000 in Revelation chapter 7 verse 3, where the angel was told, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." Yochanan then says, the second beast exercises all the authority of the first beast by making the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. By involving the earth in the worship process suggests that there is an environmental component in that worship. This, I believe, is borne out by the ever-increasing thrust of the United Nations to curtail global warming, which is seen as a major threat to the future of humanity. The UN, through the Conference of Parties, or the COP series, which had its last meeting last November in the COP29 conference, which was sponsored by the UN organization, was designed to bring all the nations of the world together for the common aim of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2035. That in itself is a form of New Age style worship. The pressure being exerted by the UN in that area of climate change alone is, however, causing considerable backlash amongst rich and poor nations as they struggle to meet the economic and environmental expectations of the UN. Hence, the global warming challenge is polarizing people in all sectors of society and turning nations against each other. In verse 13, the focus changes yet again by saying, "It performs great miracles, even causing fire to come down from heaven onto the earth as people watch." While no such miracle has ever been seen in modern history, it may well be that in the not too distant future, such a miracle may well occur. If that miracle happens, it will bring people to a state of awe and reverence for the beast. As in verse 14 says, It deceives the people living on earth by the miracles it's allowed to perform in the presence of the beast. And it tells them to make an image honouring the beast that was struck by the sword and came to life again. But what does making an image entail? As we are now rapidly moving into the era of AI, we are likely to see not only the image of people with celebrity status being thrust into the media market in the form of false advertising, but also actual computer-generated avatars that will pose and speak as real people. Yet, in reality, they will be nothing more than a computer-generated image. So are Yochanan's words that are to be spoken by that second beast instructions to develop an avatar in the likeness of that first beast? If so, then what would an avatar of the United Nations look like? That remains to be seen. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this whole narrative is found in verse 15, when Yochanan says, "It, the second beast, was allowed to put breath into the image of the first beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak. It was allowed to cause anyone who would not worship the image of the beast to be put to death." Is that the reality for the world that lies ahead of us in the near future? Or is that what we are already seeing, perhaps in America, as a direct backlash against the accepted norms of the Western democratic world? Is what President Trump currently doing an overreaction to the Western world's embrace of the UN and, of course, liberal democracy? Is it possible that we're seeing the beginning of yet another fascist backlash, similar to what occurred in Europe in the 1930s? Looking back at the collapse of the League of Nations, we see it resulted from the rise of fascism, engendered by Hitler, who became the saviour of the German people. During the Great Depression and the economic constraints imposed by England and France following World War I. So is it possible that we are witnessing yet another move away from liberal democracy that is beginning in America, and which may well spread to other nations of the democratic West? We may well be witnessing a global power struggle of epic proportions. But it is highly unlikely that any current world leader in the present political arena will be willing to capitulate to the dictates of one person, whomever that may be. No matter how charismatic a leader may be, it does not seem possible that the Western nations, or even the nations of Asia, will ever allow one person to dominate the whole world scene. So will the world be forced to capitulate to the dictates of an avatar? There are many questions still to be answered, and the march of history will slowly reveal more and more of the powerful struggle that is presently going on between Yeshua as the Lamb of God and his arch rival, Satan, the adversary. These are truly troubled times in which we are now living. So we are on a continuing journey as we continue our journey through the latter parts of Revelation. I pray that Yahweh will make it clearer his sovereign plan as he brings this Olam Hazar, this present age, to its close. But we can rest assured with the knowledge that on the day of Bikurim in 30 CE, Yeshua was given all authority both in heaven and on earth, and he is yet to exercise that authority to the fullest extent when his Father gives him approval to return to earth. So until that day dawns, we must wait patiently, remaining steadfast in our sure and certain knowledge that we will be delivered when the time draws near. So until we meet again, Shabbat Shalom. And as a postscript, the answer to 666, I don't believe is yet known. I wouldn't dare to try and put a name to it. Maybe in the near future it will be revealed.